My name is Greg Caruso. I am director of the Patrick J. Waide Center for Applied Ethics here at Fairfield University. And this is our Waide Center seminar series, which we hold annually, usually about four speakers in the fall, four speakers in the spring. And I'm very excited about today's speaker, who I'll introduce in a moment. Just a word on the Waide Center. We have three strategic missions. It includes research, outreach, and curriculum. So the Waide Center offers courses in business ethics, environmental ethics, healthcare ethics, and a host of other applied ethics courses. We offer our minor in applied ethics as well as our ethics and law minor. Um, and as part of our art outreach, we organize a host of different speaker series and seminar series and a annual Quick Center event, which is held in our Quick Center for the arts here on Fairfield University's campus. Next week is our Quick Center event with John Tsoulis, who is the director of the Institute for Applied Ethics at Oxford University. And he will be giving a talk on business responsibility, human rights, and AI. So it should be a very interesting evening if you can make it out. So I'm very excited today to introduce our speaker, our Edward Freeman, who is a university professor and Olson Professor of Business Administration and an academic director of the Institute for Business Ethics at the University of Virginia Darden School of Business. He's also an adjunct professor of stakeholder management at the Copenhagen Business School in Denmark, a visiting professor in the Netherlands, an adjunct professor of management at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. He's held honorary appointments as the Welling Professor at George Washington University and the Garley Professorship at the University of Melbourne. Prior to teaching at Darden School, Professor Freeman taught at the University of Minnesota, as well as the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. For those of you who've taken my courses or at all interested or aware of business ethics, you know the influence of Professor Freeman's work. He's the author and editor of over 100 volumes and 200 articles in the areas of stakeholder management, business strategy, and business ethics. He's perhaps best known for his award-winning book, Strategic Management, A Stakeholder Approach, which was originally published in 1984 and really is the father of stakeholder theory in its modern form. So I am very excited to introduce our speaker for today, Ed Freeman.
Thanks, Greg. It's very nice to be with you. I want to beg your pardon if I lapse into a coughing fit in the middle. I just got back from a lot of travel, and when you're on an airplane with 450 of your closest friends, you generally come back with a respiratory thing, which I have. So I want to just apologize for that, but I'm sure my body will betray me partway through. It's very nice to be here. I have visited Fairfield before, but very much in the distant past. And it's a terrific place and a terrific place to learn about ethics. And the program that you have there is really one of the best applied ethics programs that I know about in the world. And so it's a real treat to be able to talk to you today. I want to talk about this idea, does business ethics have a future? Now, as a business ethicist, the answer better be yes. And it is. But I think it might be a slightly different future than many people think. And I want to try to give you a brief history that will be incredibly stylized, which means just my view of it. You don't have to agree. And I want to start by thinking about the academic field of business ethics. Now, if you're a student, you might not care so much about that. If you're a faculty member, well, you might not care about it either, but you probably should. And it's business ethics is, of course, an old idea. You could trace it back to the Phoenician traders. You can find it in things like the Mahabharata, the sacred scriptures in Hinduism. You can find it in most all of the text of most of the world's religions, and of course, businesses have been operating and taking ethics into account for hundreds of years. But as an academic discipline, business ethics is pretty new. It had its philosophical beginnings probably in the late 1970s, 1980s. Um, a bunch of people then started talking about social issues in business. They were more social scientists. Then people started to, from the disciplines of business, marketing, finance, etc., start to move in. There was kind of a counter movement called critical management studies, and I want to talk a little bit about each of those. In philosophy, it kind of started, most part, with a question: Is can the corporation be a moral person? Corporations are persons before the law, but does that translate into being a moral person, and hence capable of being morally responsible? To answer that question, people invoked what I would call the big three moral theories: deontology, or rights and principles; consequences, or things like utilitarianism and egoism; and uh, issues around character or virtue. And most of that early work was around what I would call horror story cases. It was around bribery, cases where people had died, where there were scandals, where honestly the ethical questions weren't very hard. You know, it's like, don't do that. I would get calls in the day. There was a case in Bhopal in India where a Union Carbide plant leaked some bad stuff, and it killed a couple of thousand people. So people from the press would call and go, Professor Freeman, what do you think about Bhopal? And it's not a hard question. Try not to kill a couple of thousand people in your communities. That didn't require a lot of ethical heavy lifting here. There were some critical texts in the area. A colleague of mine, Patricia Werhane, wrote a book called Employee Rights, and she really was the founding mother of the academic discipline. She started Business Ethics Quarterly, the main journal in the field. Her colleague, they were both at Loyola in Chicago, started, Tom Donaldson wrote a book called Concept of the Corporation. And really, it was the Jesuit universities at the time that really were the leaders in starting business ethics as a discipline, as they had required ethics courses in their curriculum for a long time. A philosopher named Noam Bowie told us sort of what Kant would say about those things, and Robert Solomon from Texas and Ed Hartman at Rutgers talked about Aristotle. But they were not much concerned with real business decisions, and for the most part, they were coming from philosophy departments. Now, at the same time, there were a number of people in business schools who thought that the idea that businesses just ought to make profits was at best incomplete, and they started to think about corporate social responsibility, or CSR. These were mostly social scientists, not philosophers. They traced the origins of the CSR concept back to a guy named Howard Bowen in a book in 1953. Very famously, Milton Friedman, if you've taken a course, I know you've seen this, wrote an article. It was in the New York Times magazine section, called something like "The Only Obligation of Businesses to Maximize Profits." And what Friedman was arguing against was the idea of CSR as having companies do stuff they didn't know anything about. And he thought that really focusing on shareholders was the way to do it. And there was this argument kind of against, it wasn't against ethics, it was against managers self-dealing, doing things that were good for themselves, but not necessarily good for their shareholders or their other stakeholders, I might add. Some of the names in this social issues area were people like Archie Carroll and Jim Post and Lee Preston, Ed Epstein, Donna Wood, and a whole bunch of others. And mainly they used social science methods and saw themselves as sort of empirical social scientists. But they too, uh, loved the horror story cases, loved to find cases of where business had done something wrong or something hadn't worked out. And so, but both sides of this national academic discipline, I think, were obsessed with horror stories. They didn't think too much about the good that business has done as well. In fact, they use what I would call a kind of saints and sinners law logic. Most business people are kind of, greedy little bastards that are trying to do each other in. They're competitive. Business works because it's all about the money. And you might find a few people who try to do it differently, and let's lift them up. They're the saints. But as soon as the saints stumbled, they got lopped over into the sinner category. This old story of business, which I've called the business sucks story, is pretty much still dominant, even though it's changing, I hope. The problem with saints and sinners logic is that Oscar Wilde said it best: every saint's got a past, every sinner's got a future. It's not who we are as human beings to be one or the other. Well, sometime after the sort of academic discipline and the journal got started, there's kind of a détente. Philosophers began to pay more attention to business, and social scientists began to pay at least a little bit of attention to philosophy. In terms of the academic discipline, there are two groups. There was a Society for Business Ethics and a group at the Academy of Management called Social Issues in Management. And during this time in the, I would say, late 80s and early 90s, there was kind of a détente. There were several of us. I was one who who were deemed okay by both groups, and so a few of us became the president of each group, and there was some more interaction than there had been in the past. And also, there's some a really interesting work that was done. Patricia Werhane wrote about moral imagination. She thought that ethical problems that she found in companies existed because people had a failure of imagination. She had moved to Darden by the time, away from philosophy departments. Tom Donaldson had moved to Wharton, away from philosophy departments. He and Tom Dunphy wrote a book called On Integrated Social Contract. I think the book was called The Ties That Bind. And what they did was try to take the social contract metaphor from Locke and Rawls and others and apply it to companies. And a number of people were working on these ideas. And the sort of theoretical uh, edifice of the field really began to get established then. And of course, there was the emergence of stakeholder theory as a kind of critical concept for both sides, but there were many others as well. And then what happened in the sort of 2000s, and especially after the global financial crisis of 2008, is the people in the disciplines said, oh, we better work on this too. I mean, the financial crisis showed that actually focusing only on shareholder value could actually destroy a lot of shareholder value, as it destroyed several trillion dollars worth, and also destroyed value for other stakeholders. And we're still seeing some of the vestigial effects of the global financial crisis in the world financial system. People in marketing adopted some CSR issues and began to think about things like conscious capitalism with Raj Sisodia and Whole Foods founder John Mackey. And C.B. Bhattacharya began to think about not just CSR, but especially environmental issues and what marketing's role in environmental issues are. Finance kind of went haywire with ESG and impact investing and all the controversies with that. One of the names was Luigi Zingales at University of Chicago, who worked with an economist named Oliver Hart to talk about incomplete contracts. And once you think the contracts that are business contracts are incomplete, and that just means maybe I don't know what's going to happen all the time, I can't predict that. This opens room to think about, well, who else is involved in this who might have something to contribute, and that's the stakeholders, of course. In entrepreneurship, they developed an idea called social entrepreneurship, and I think that's because, again, of this business sucks story. If you think that uh, business is somehow morally questionable, then you need to sort of think about, well, social business is okay. And so you have social entrepreneurship, you have Muhammad Yunus in Bangladesh developing the idea of social business, where you made your investment back, but you didn't make any profits. And two of my colleagues, Sarah Sarasvathy and Sanitarian Venkatraman, really helped develop the field of entrepreneurship again as a discipline without separating business and ethics. Strategy at the time, well, now strategy has discovered stakeholder theory and the idea of purpose with Jay Barney, Anita McGann, and others. But the strategy folks have always seen themselves as scientists, as not wanting to do normative work. And one of the key ideas of stakeholder theory is that normative stuff counts. When I call you a stakeholder, I'm saying you matter, and so I'm doing some normative work here. So that's how the discipline was evolving. And somewhere in the 90s, there was sort of a counter movement, really, and it's called critical management studies, or I call them the crits. They emerged along the lines of critical legal studies, which was really an attempt to show that the legal system consisted mostly not of law and rationality, but of power and elites. And this was the critics in management were mostly uh, skeptical of a large-scale institution of business. They, for the most part, all believed the business sucks story. And there was very little positive program. They did some. There's been some good work here in the sense of, pointing out where business can be better, but no idea about how they could be better, etc. So it was more of a let's take down business, and mostly large public corporations is what they were worried about, and very little how do we make business better. So there are a bunch of challenges when you think about business ethics. You will have seen some of them in your core courses, or if you've tried to teach it. One of the problems of teaching business ethics is everybody knows about ethics. As I've often said, everybody who needs to go to the ethics seminar, please raise their hand. And no one raises their hand, of course. And the second challenge is in business schools, we need to be relevant to businesses. And you can't be relevant to businesses if you don't talk to any, if you don't engage with them. You can write all the papers in the world, and nobody's going to care unless you're out there working with businesses and dealing with real problems. The third thing is, I don't think the kind of traditional moral theory, deontology, consequentialism, and virtue, and even if you add the ethics of care here, I don't think that is very robust. It's fine at a really high level, but when I get down to sort of what am I going to do tomorrow? I mean, it's fine for a high level to avoid horror stories, but if I'm thinking about, gee, I have a meeting tomorrow, and am I going to reveal what my client told me in confidence that will really affect how we negotiate this contract? Uh, the big three theories don't help you very, very, very much. And I would say one of the biggest challenges for teaching business ethics I've found is this old narrative that business is about the money, that people are short-term, self-interested economic beings. It's really got a grip on most people. I mean, we teach that some in the business schools. We shouldn't, but we do. And that narrative gets a grip on people, and it's hard to get out of that. When you talk to real business people, of course, making money matters, but that's not the only thing that matters. And that old narrative is something that I think we need to leave behind. In the academic world, professors are um, in business schools are almost obsessed with methodology. So I call it the methodology media. Methodology being the making method an idol. There's the idea that if I follow this method, truth will emerge, versus thinking about what's the narrative? How does the narrative make us better off? Another challenge is that, again, I've been writing about this for a long time. We engage in something called the separation fallacy. There's business on the one hand and ethics on the other. And if I tell somebody I teach business ethics, I want to put those things together, they have to manage not to laugh. They have to say things like, "Oh yeah, it must be a short course," or "I didn't know business had any ethics," or two words you put them together, contradiction. Like, well, I went to Duke, so I'll say Duke football, uh, and um, or jumbo shrimp. Sorry. Um, in this, or I was in a bar in Copenhagen actually, and talking to someone I was interested in. Said, "What do you do?" I said, "I teach business ethics," and they said, "Oh, that's a theoretical subject, isn't it?" So thinking about, you know, how we don't separate, we need to put business and ethics together, not separate them more. And look, there's some seriously difficult problems for business ethics. Problems like the one I mentioned, some of the everyday problems. It's not a big problem, about killing thousands of people in your communities. We know not to do that, but there are questions of how we treat each other every day. Do we always tell exactly everything we know? It's about things like the quality of our relationships. What happens when an employee comes to you and says, "Look, I've got a real family problem that's been affecting my work"? Do you turn them in? Do you try to get help for them? How we treat each other every day isn't, for my mind, much more important in business ethics than most of the stuff that we write about in terms of the horror stories. So if we're going to create a future for business ethics, I think one of the things we have to do is we have to be immersed in the practice of business. We have to be we have to get out there and engage with business people and talk to them. I'm really lucky at Darden. My students all have 5+ years of experience, and I get to talk to a lot of executives, and I've worked with a bunch of companies over the years, and that has led me to, I think, appreciate the kinds of real business problems that are there. And when I was sort of one of the people that was developing stakeholder theory, I tried to develop it around the business problems that were there. And that leads me to think about the other pieces of this sort of creating a few future. What problems are we trying to solve? In the academic world, the problems most business school professors are trying to solve is, how do I get my research published in a top journal? And to be honest with you, that's not a very interesting problem. It's not a very interesting problem for business. I think there are no business executives. No is probably too strong, but they're close to zero business executives who are wondering, "Gee, I wonder what those academics figured out about business that'll help my business today. I can't wait to read the latest issue of Academy of Management Review or Administrative Sciences Quarterly or Academy of Management Journal." No one's thinking about that. In fact, when I told this joke to a friend of mine who's a CEO, I thought he was having an attack. He was laughing so hard about this. And that's a problem. If business school professors are doing stuff that is irrelevant to managers, we ought to take stock of what that is. What problems are we really trying to solve, and should we be trying to solve? We need to see not methodology, but you know, narrative, and thinking about the stories that we're trying to tell. Now, some of those stories might be better if we have, if they're based on some data from a program in R, or if they're based on some simultaneous equation models. But there's still stories that we're trying to tell to make the world a better place, to make business better. The problem is we try to generalize to all problems. We want stuff that is theoretical in the sense that it'll apply to all businesses and all problems at all times. And I think that's a fool's errand. One size fits a few, but it doesn't fit many. And so what I'm suggesting here is that we become more pragmatic, more of a philosophical pragmatist. And I want to spend just a minute thinking about this because I think John Dewey gives us some help here as to how to do that. Dewey had an idea that we needed to get inside the problem. Now think about it for a minute. When you have an ethics problem, a personal ethics problem, I'm going to suggest that you feel a sort of twisting in the pit of your stomach. You feel a kind of uncertainty, a kind of annoying. There's a feeling there that something's not right. And we have to get inside the problem. If what we do is use those three traditions to define the problem, so I say, okay, well, this is just the problem of figuring out the greatest good for the greatest number. We haven't felt what the problem was like. And so I think trying to figure out how we get inside a problem is incredibly important. The traditions are useful, but I like to think of them as kind of due diligence. Did you think about what the consequences were? Did you think about what rights were at issue, or what principles? How did you think about character and virtue? That's kind of a due diligence question. Just like in finance, you'd want to do the cash flows, regardless of what kind of problem it was. Dewey suggested, though, that the real issue here is how we have better conversations with each other, how we have conversations, and he had this idea called dramatic rehearsal. Now, any of you that have ever been in a case method classroom have done dramatic rehearsal. What you're trying to do is explore through conversation what might happen if you do this, what the tensions are in the problem, what are the subtleties and the nuance, how much this context matters. Sorry again. Um, and where do principles conflict with each other? Where do principles and consequences seem to lead us in different directions? And it's that conversation that's really important. We have to think about in that conversation how we mitigate things that might go wrong. If we say, well, we're ultimately going to act on this principle because we think that's the best solution for things, how are you going to mitigate the problems where some people might be disadvantaged? Ethics issues on this way also, you don't ever get rid of them. You need to kind of constantly monitor them, and it's not a kind of one decision and we're done. What could happen in the world that could cause you to change your mind? And that means even more conversation. So ethics issues along these pragmatist lines is about engaging with the world. And what I want to say here is I think the future of business ethics has to become more along these pragmatist lines. I'm not suggesting that other theoretical approaches aren't important. I am suggesting that there's an openness to business that requires a kind of openness to business ethics. There are lots of ways to run a good business, and I think there are lots of ethical ways to run a good business. So let me switch gears for a minute here and say, okay, that's one future for business ethics to develop along these pragmatist lines. And my take on the current state of the field is that's actually that we're actually moving towards that more, etc. At least on my interpretation of that. Now, what I want to do is ask you to think in the future. And I'm going to say it's 2075, but probably more like 2050 or 2040. And what I want to do is paint a very optimistic, positive scenario. Because if the optimistic, positive scenario doesn't appear, then we got a whole bunch of other issues to deal with that ultimately will have some. So let's take a really optimistic, positive view here. Um, and there's some kind of everyday issues. I want to suggest energy in this world is going to be clean and cheap. Now, if energy is clean and cheap, that doesn't mean there are no ethics issues, because who gets access to it is certainly there. I want to think about manufacturing as we can have extremely localized fabricators, even have one in your house. Again, issues around access and reliability are there. Education we might see the end of the medieval institution called university. Education in this world is going to be very different. You know, it'll be a lifelong thing where people continuously learn, etc. Government gets its act together. It starts to facilitate value creation and not just regulate, not just redistribute, not just demonize each other and different parties, but it really tries to facilitate value creation, helping people who don't have access to business to have access, helping people find the capital that they need, ensuring things like civil rights, which are incredibly important and create a lot of value because it takes people that are shut out from something and gives them a choice. And technology in this world is phenomenal. Incredible medical technology. IT transmission goes to pretty much zero. We'll have people in this world that are enhanced humans. They'll be part human, but they'll have, computer chips in glasses or in their brain or something like that. The medical technology in terms of healing and etc. will be incredible. And there's still lots of ethics issues here. Excuse me. Yeah. um, so there's still lots of ethics issues in this world. And you could describe this world as, it's getting greener. But we kind of figured out global warming. Again, if this scenario doesn't take place, we got a whole host of other problems that ethicists need to deal with. So I'm taking the best case and trying to show that there are a whole set of, I think, more subtle problems than we might think. So in general, Earth's getting greener. There's still 10 billion people, and by the way, we're living a lot longer. I think those of you who are students, you have prospects of living to well over 100 years old. Too late for me. Greg, I don't know. Maybe you might make it under, but lots of issues there because what are 10 billion people who grow up with AI going to do? Are there going to be jobs? Is there access to this rejuvenation and medical technology, etc.? So there's still going to be inequality, and there's a chance even for even more societal and political fragmentation. So I think I'll be able to, in those days, I could probably do it now, only talk to people who were pragmatist philosophers, martial artists, piano and organ players, and science fiction fanatics, all of which I am. And so it's possible to fragment even more with these kinds of technologies that we have. And at least some of us in that world will have been transformed. We'll be part cyborg, maybe if you like, or certainly we'll have computer enhanced capabilities. Well, what about business in that world? Well, this old story that business is about the money will be seen as kind of quaint, and as my millennial kids say to me, "Dad, that just happened back in the day." And they'll think it's funny that, hey, back in the day, people thought shareholders or investors were the only group that matters. So things like CSR, sustainability, business ethics, stakeholder capitalism will be taken as kind of table stakes. Of course, you got to do that stuff. That's what business is. Business ethics will no longer be seen as a joke. Um, because I write about this, I have to put this in. I think stakeholder capitalism will rule the day. Businesses are founded on purpose. They're generally able to be noble. They're celebrated. And they try to create value for their stakeholders, not just their investors. Governments try to facilitate that. And there's, excuse me, cooperation between the key institutions in society. Good business leadership is seen not as maximizing profits for shareholders, but as creating as much value as you can for stakeholders. And we routinely use the stakeholder vocabulary to solve our business problems. In other words, we've used this stakeholder vocabulary to deal effectively with the problems it was designed to help with. How's value creation and trade possible in a world where there's very little stability and certainty? How do we deal with the ethics of capitalism? What do we teach in business schools? And the stakeholder vocabulary under this scenario has kind of ruled the day. Um, what about ethics? Well, the general ethics picture in 2075, there are a lot of Gattaca issues, a lot of issues around DNA and what we're able to predict and all of that stuff. There are issues around access. Who gets access to the technology? This will be especially true in the medical field. There are lots of upheavals and disruptions due to things like clean energy and localized manufacturing. And then we have the kind of 500-pound gorilla here, the role of AI. What about human AI combinations? What would it be like to have an AI chip in my brain or available to it? How can we deal with entities that honestly are just going to be smarter than us? Um, what's the connection between AI and sort of political power, etc.? Truly sorry to keep coughing, but there's not much I can do about that. Uh, issues around fairness, transparency, access, all these things are going to be there. And what happens to kind of cornerstone ideas like privacy and property? My favorite example is to think about property. These glasses are mine. I got them. You don't. My property. I have it. You don't have it. But if most of our property that we have is a series of zeros and ones, I can have it, and you can have it too, for virtually no cost. And so, what happens to this stuff theory of property? Well, we already see this in questions about intellectual property, etc. But intellectual property is a way to solve this. So far, we haven't figured it out because it requires too much agreement across too many political differences here. So that's a real issue here, it seems to me. And probably similar things about trust. How do you trust and how do you begin to trust an AI? I think that's a huge issue. Um, but there are more subtle issues, and to me, more interesting issues. One issue in this world is what happens to our sense of mystery and ambiguity? With so much openness, so little privacy, we can know so much. What happens to our curiosity? Is it increased? Is it decreased? Because I can have my AI know lots of stuff. I mean, I happen to know that Mickey Mantle, an old baseball hero, hit 356 in 1957 and 52 home runs, or 54 home runs, I think. But I don't need to know that anymore because I can just ask I can ask Mr. Google now, and the AI would have it at my fingertips. What happens to mystery when we don't have that? Our sense of mystery, and if you think about your own relationships, the sense of mystery and ambiguity. If you can predict exactly what your partner is going to do all the time, every day, it's not very interesting anymore. I've been married for 48 years, and I have to say we continually surprise each other. And that's a good thing because the point of connection with others is that it's not just what we can predict on the screen. It's about a human connection. It's about, intimate relationships and friendships and things like touch and trust. And what happens with our connect on our with our ability to form these relationships? I once very recently went into a restaurant and there were four young women who looked like they were students here, and they were sitting at the table, and I thought, oh, that's nice. They're out to dinner with each other. But all four of them were had their phones open, and they were on their phones. I don't know why they actually went out to dinner together, because they basically were on their phones the whole time. Now, I say this as a dad of twins, and my twins have texted each other at the table. So I understand that sometimes that's necessary. But I am worried about this idea how we make connections with others. There's a third issue here that I've called Glaucon's problem. In the Republic, Glaucon and Thrasymachus proposed that what would you do if you had a ring called the Ring of Gyges? You put the ring on your finger, you turn it, and you're invisible. And so you could get away with doing a lot. Well, the truth is, we have a Ring of Gyges now. It's called social media. We can actually define different personas for ourselves. And this is only going to increase and get easier to do. So this question of who are you really? What are your values really? I think gets heightened when we're able to create different personas. And we see this now with all the scams and all that sort of stuff. But that will be increasingly, I think, difficult to deal with. So part of the subtle issue here is what's our sense of self? How are we going to think about ourselves? We want to do something unique. We want to stand out from the herd, and we want to fit in. We want to find, connections with others. We want relationships with others, and we want to stand out. What does our sense of being social animals evolve to here? I think these are open questions, and questions that, as ethicists and people worried about ethics, we need to think through. Well, what happens to business ethics as a discipline? I think sort of positivism, behaviorism will be finally dead. I think the big three theory will be seen as not very useful. I think they're not very useful today. I think actually the phrase business ethics will be seen as a phrase, as my kids say, from the 1900s or from way back in the day. What we're going to do is rewrite both business theory and ethical theory to escape separating them out. We're going to think about what people like Bernard Williams calls ethically thick ideas. Think about your marketing courses for a minute. Yeah, that was the 4 P's: price, promotion, place, and product. Suppose there's a fifth P called promise. We see brands as promises. We see consumers as moral persons. That we ethically thicken the concepts in the business disciplines. We see supply chains as responsibility chains. We see thinking about finance as what finance does is enable the creation of building a better society. And ethically thickening the disciplines of business means that those who know something about ethics are going to have to learn a lot more about the disciplines, and vice versa. Scholars from the disciplines of business are going to have to learn a lot more about ethics. We're going to have some new problems, I think. I've talked a little bit about these. I'll just be quick about it. There's a problem of humility. How do we deal with the fact that our AIs are basically smarter than we are, can make better decisions most of the time, faster, can give us real-time feedback about how we're doing, and about whether we are actually doing what we say we believe in. There's a whole lot of interesting short stories about uh, this sort of people falling in love with their AI, literally falling in love, and that's a real phenomena today. And would you want to know if you couldn't tell if the person you fell in love with was a real person or an artificial person? Would you want to know? Would you want to know if it's an artificial person and is a lot smarter than you could ever be? I think those are really interesting and difficult questions. There's a problem of curiosity and creative imagination. I think the biggest challenge for business schools is how do we train people? How do we help them train their creative imagination? Because that's going to be all we have left. The factual stuff, the predictable linear stuff, the AI is going to do all that. The third problem is how do we create a life, create a sense of self? Can we see ourselves as authors of our stories, or are we just going to be the characters in somebody else's story? Can we embrace the self as fundamentally relational so that we see ourselves as enmeshed in a set of relationships with others? And finally, and this is probably the most worrisome one for me now, can we develop conversations despite the fact that we don't believe the same thing, despite the fact that we may have real moral differences? Can we learn how to talk to each other better? Because if we can't, then democracy has seen its day. We need to create democratic and inclusive institutions where we can listen to each other, where we can solve our problems together. Many people think of democracy as a system of voting, but as Dewey rightly pointed out, voting without the institutions to back up the voting, things like education, things like uh, communities that can pull together to solve their own local problems, things without healthcare and healthcare institutions that solve the needs of communities, not nations as a whole. Without those institutions that are democracy, that won't work. And we focus way too much, even today, on the voting. This is likely to get worse, rather than building the institutions that we need to have uh, citizens that can really create better communities. Well, let me end with thinking about what about business schools? Uh, I've already said we need to figure out how to exercise our creative imagination. I'm very lucky to teach at a school where we actually do courses on leadership and theater and music and literature and those kinds of humanities that help us create help us build our creative imagination. I think we'll see companies, especially with the technologies going, rely less on man and management and more on self-direction in leadership and thinking about relationships. Companies are already starting to have more and more conversations about what really matters here. What's our purpose? What are our values? Who do we want to serve? Those questions are beginning to be seen as important as how do we get competitive advantage. Um, we don't know what jobs they'll be, but we know they won't be the ones that are there now. So how do you build a workforce of continuous learners? How can business tools prepare you not for your first job? How can business tools prepare you for a job that you don't know you're going to have? And I think that's a hard question to do, but it has to do with turning people into continuous learners rather than the way we do it now, which is assessing how much of particular disciplines you know with exams and that sort of stuff. And I think we need to encourage our students to routinely examine their lives and recreate themselves in ways that leaves them psychologically whole rather than psychologically damaged. Can we embrace what I think are the social and evolutionary nature and begin to live with the earth rather than in harm to the earth? In short, we need a change in our idea of who we are. The future of business ethics is the future, in my mind, we have exactly the place to say we need to think about who we are as human beings. Think for a minute of what we had to do. I have a iPhone here. Think what we had to do when we were coming down from the savannas of the trees in the savannas in Africa millennia ago. What do we have to do to get to iPhone? We had to invent a whole bunch of vocabularies from physics to chemistry to metal to glass to all kinds of stuff that goes on the inside of this I don't understand. And then we had to figure out how to collaborate together to actually make those things. What humans are is we're language using collaborators. We invent vocabularies to solve our problems, and we work together to uh, cooperate to make those solutions real. Yes, we also compete, and all that stuff is important, but it's not as important as the glue that holds business together. The glue that holds us together is our ability to cooperate together to do stuff that no one of us can do alone. I think the world of the future is not a world of scarcity. I think, given our creative imagination, if we can create an iPhone, I am convinced we can solve problems like gender discrimination, racism, poverty, global warming. But it will take substantial creative imagination and substantial cooperation and substantial change in our political processes to encourage that rather than discourage that. We need to embrace the abundance meaning what we're able to create up here. And we transform the world, we transform our resources, we transform ourselves and our communities in order to solve the challenges that we have. Well, I put this forward as a view for 2075 or 2050. The truth is, it's our challenges now. And I think we need to lean into those challenges now. We need to be the generations that create a better, fairer, more inclusive world that we want our children to live in. We need to make business a critical institution in that world and a beacon of hope for everyone. Let me stop there and see if anybody has any questions or comments. And it's okay to say that's the worst talk I've ever heard, or I wish you'd stop coughing, or whatever it is. I did martial arts for 10 years. And when you do that, if you can give a punch, you better be able to take one. So let me stop there and
Thank you, Ed. Yeah, can you unshare your screen?
yeah,
Would be great.
maybe. Yeah,
And
I'll share.
so at the bottom, you could just do stuff. Yep, great.
Yeah.
So for audience members, I should have said this at the beginning. We unfortunately can't see each other, but if you use the raise hand function at the bottom of the screen, I can unmute you and you can ask your question. Or if you feel more comfortable, you could always type your question into the chat box, and I will gladly read that question to the speaker. So, Eric Peterson, I'm going to unmute you and.
Can you hear me?
Yep, can hear you.
Great. Professor Freeman, thank you so much for this talk. I really, really enjoyed it. I've been thinking a lot about both my approach to teaching business ethics and also just the research that I'm interested in. I just have this, the phrase that comes to mind is relational business ethics. And I just keep thinking about relationships and the importance of relationships. So I'm with you yeah, very moved by that. I would like to see if I could maybe push back, or maybe this is just I can sort of redescribe something and see if you would agree with me
Sure.
on this. And that is in terms of the big three. So I'm kind of a pluralist. I enjoy teaching David Ross, but I'm also like heavily, very much into Aristotle and Aquinas on virtue. And so I guess with the statement, the big three are dead. I wonder if you would agree that, and so here's where I might agree with that. I might agree if we take business issues and then just try to like stuff them in this box
Yeah.
of like, hey, here's what Kant says, or here's,
And
I think
that's
I
what
totally,
happened that's what happened in the 70s and 80s, and that's
sure.
what I'm against.
Okay, and I would agree with that. So would you agree with me that like, so I'm looking at the um, um, the problem of humility and
Uh-huh.
curiosity, creative imagination. Like I see a lot of that, and of course relationships. I see all of that requiring a kind of virtue, requiring cultivation of
Yeah. So
prudence
look,
and
I let's say to say they're dead. I only meant the idea that we can reduce things to
sure.
one of them.
Yep.
You know, everything's a every problem is a virtue problem. Every problem's a
Good.
problem or greatest good for the greatest number. What that does, according to Dewey, I think he's right, is it intellectualizes the problem. You can't get inside the problem if you do that. You can get
Sure.
inside the problem, feel things, and still have to do the due diligence.
Good.
And this is the way we teach it here. If we get inside the problem, I still want to know what principles are at issue. Where's the, but I want to know where there's a conflict between principles and character. And I want to know. I think the one of the things I really liked about what you said is if I had to pick one of the big three, I'd pick the fourth one, which is care,
Sure.
because care
Yeah.
and connection is about relationships. And ultimately, the problems that we have, for the most part, are problems about our relationships. And if I had to start, or if someone said that's the only, you can only pick one of these, that's what I'd pick. Because even within the tradition of care, there are questions about fairness, there are questions about consequences,
Mhm.
etc. So I think that fits business in a way better. I think people understand that, for instance, when we think about business, we have to think about not only ethics, we have to think about stakeholders. But I don't think that the idea that this is relational has gotten there yet.
Mm.
I tell executives they got to love their stakeholders.
Mhm.
If you love your stakeholders, there's a presumption. If when you're in a relationship, there's a presumption the relationship's going to continue. The only way that works is if both parties to the relationship care about it.
Mm.
And the third thing that happens is you don't have to keep score all the time when you're in a relationship. If I were to go down the hall to my wife's office here at Darden and say, "Hey, babe, we've been married 48 years and I've been doing some thinking and I think you're up three. I think you owe me three." I'm pretty sure I know what the answer to that would be. She's a second degree black belt in Taekwondo. I've had my hips replaced. I can't really run. It would not be a healthy thing. Why? If you're in a relationship, you don't keep score all the time.
Mm.
Sometimes relationships have to end, and it's painful. But if you're always keeping score, you're in this transactional world.
Mm.
And that to me is a huge barrier to thinking about business ethics and to think about business in a way that's helpful. Business is fundamentally relational.
Yeah. Good.
And we economists don't, for the most part, and it's not completely true, don't understand this.
All right. I got a lot of questions in the written comments. So let me
Mhm.
read one. So Matt Caulfield, you might know Matt.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Hey, man.
Matt's question is, I wonder if there's a tension between the pragmatist commitments to what works and the forward-looking abstraction necessary to think about possible but not yet here futures. So I guess questioning the tension between the pragmatist tendencies and your commitment to pragmatism and the forward-looking abstraction necessary to think about possible, not yet here futures.
Well, I think pragmatists can think about possible near futures as well. I mean, look, that's just trying to be what Dewey would call intelligent. Trying to understand how you know futures may evolve so that we don't solve the wrong problem. So I don't really see a tension there, Matt. Maybe you want to say some more about that.
I'll give him an opportunity to raise his hand if he's available.
Okay.
I'll go to the next question first. Anthony Toronto. Can you give your best interpretation, explanation of the stakeholder paradox, where impartiality seems both impermissible and required in corporate decision making?
Um, you're going to have to tell me more about the stakeholder paradox
Yeah.
because I think some problems you need impartiality and some problems you don't.
Yeah.
What I don't want to say is there's one way to think about this that's going to work for all problems, for all times, for all businesses. I just don't. I think those solutions, which many people want to find, just don't exist because there are lots of business in my world is a family resemblance idea.
Mhm.
There's not kind of one definition that works for all of them. So are things like leadership. I'm a pluralist about a lot of things here.
Next one, I'll get to the
Sure.
ones that have their hands raised in 1 second. Nevin Nordstrom, I'm sorry if I'm saying that incorrectly. How might AI change the way we make ethical decisions in the future?
Yeah. You know, I read a lot of the AI ethics literature and I was pretty much underwhelmed by a lot of it because I think a lot of people writing that don't know much about kind of modern ethical theory. And so they talked about fairness and transparency and those things. And I guess those are important. But I think there are a whole bunch of other questions that we haven't even begun to consider now. I put this against the backdrop of a personal situation, which we had a revise and resubmit for a paper. I think it was second round, and we did a review back from the methodology editor, actually, of the journal, that said, you must read this paper and you must do these things that the paper said. Except the paper didn't exist.
Mm.
Clearly, someone had used an AI to to do the review,
Uh-huh.
and it made stuff up.
Yeah, yeah.
So when we're dealing with entities where we can't, I mean, if I'm talking to you, our assumptions are that we pretty much believe what we're saying. I think Quine and others have pretty much shown us that language can't work if we don't believe what we're saying,
Mm.
etc. And when that's not there, I have a hard time figuring out how to deal with that
Yeah.
because it makes me want to check everything. If I check everything, why am I using it in the first place? So I think there are huge challenges here, and I don't know how to do it, but if we only dealt with ethics and AI in business, I think we'd have full employment act for all the business ethicists that we needed here.
Okay. One more written question, then I'll
Sure.
take the hand. So Gary Frazier, NYU Stern
Mhm.
Business School. Thank you, Professor Freeman. I teach professional responsibility at NYU Stern and use some of your work in class. My question is, do you think this evolution in thinking and approach towards business will be bottom up versus top down? So that's the first question.
Yeah.
As business will continue, what's it? As business will continue the way it does, as you say, unless a newer generation redefines it. So I don't know about the second part.
Well, I think it's going to be both. It has to be pressure from bottom. One of the things we see in business schools is students pressuring us to help find them jobs, which are not meaningless, horrible jobs.
Mhm.
You know, that students want to be, they want jobs that have meaning, and they want to be well paid too. That translates into the business community. I've had so many CEOs say to me, I just don't know how to deal with Gen Z or millennials. I don't know what they want. I typically tell them, do you have teenagers? And if they say yes, I said, well, if you can deal with your teenagers, you can deal with that. So I think that's there. But the other thing I see is that CEOs are changing too. I'm one of those people who think that the Business Roundtable statement in 2019 that stakeholder capitalism was the kind of new way to think about business
Mhm.
was revolutionary. Now, that's not that all businesses have done all the things they need to do, but you at least got to start to talk about it before you can do it.
Mhm.
And so at least they legitimize the vocabulary. And many of them, if you go to Just Capital website and see what they're doing, many of them are doing lots of incredible things. Now, this may be things that they've always done. And again, I've always thought the stakeholder idea was about as simple an idea as you could get. You know, most companies have always created value and sometimes destroyed it for customers, suppliers, employees, communities, people, and money. Uh, but using the vocabulary matters here because now it's like that Moliere character, I forget his name in the novel, who discovers he was already speaking prose.
Mhm.
Oh, this is what we're doing. Yeah, now I can improve the hell out of it. Now I can actually think about how when I create value for customers, what does that do for my employees? What does that do for my uh, community? What does that do for my investors? And you can think about the interconnections, and it's capturing those interconnections. That's the most important thing here.
Robert Francis, let me unmute you and you can ask your question. Go ahead. So,
I hate to start with an apology, uh, but I joined this a little bit late, and in joining because I was teaching my class
I
on.
think that counts as an excuse.
Can you hear me?
yes, we
Yes.
can hear you, Bob. Go ahead.
Oh, okay, good. Uh, so uh, so I'm going to apologize if you already dealt with this in the first 20 minutes or so of your talk. But I teach ethics in the community, and what I'm teaching is is generally ethical theory. And I heard you say at the end here there shouldn't be a separation between business ethics and ethical theory. And so, what do I need to learn about the business side of this? Because I've got a number of business students in my class, but I
Yeah.
also have a number of people who work in the healthcare field in my class who are already, I mean, their ethics in healthcare is much closer to the ethical theory work. So,
Well, I mean, my own suggestion, I'll tell you what the way we try to do it is to, and you probably already do this, is to deal with the problems that they have. We ask our students to each write a short kind of one-page case of an ethical issue that they've dealt with, and then we
mhm,
we deal with those in class. And we've given them all kinds of readings. We give them readings about stakeholders and shareholders. We give them readings about um, other kinds of ethical theory, the big theories, etc. But our conversations about the problems, about trying to get inside the problems, discover the nuances, discover the tensions and the difficulties. There's nothing wrong with teaching ethical theory, of course. It's just you want to help. I want to help students solve the problems that they have, and be prepared to solve the ones that they're gonna face. So we do pretty much, and this is in part Darden is this way as a whole as a school. It's all case based, and we'll
mhm.
we'll 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 give them some reading and stuff, but it's real business problems. Um, and that means we have to know, we have to go out and spend time um, with businesses to be sure that we're writing cases that are real problems. And then we have for several classes in the course, it's a required course here. We have several days where we'll do their own cases. So
Mhm.
I find trying to use the students' experiences in class to be the critical part. We did a case I think it was last year. It was a case that a student had written about a harassment case, and it was tricky, it was nuanced, and uh, and then someone else in the class said, "Yeah, this is exactly what happened in the company I was in." And we had a fairly big discussion about how widespread this was, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I find those case-based discussions uh, pretty energizing.
And
And
as far as I'm concerned, Mr. Freeman, those should be business problem cases uh, that we have people take a look at from an ethical theory perspective.
well, I would just say from an ethical perspective,
Ethical
I dropped the
perspective.
I
Yeah,
dropped the theory part, but the idea is not here's the business problem. Now let me tell you what the theory tells you to do.
yeah.
So I would see it as here's the problem. Let's figure out, given that we know a lot about ethical theory, let's figure out what parts are relevant and what parts are not. because I think all of the ethical theory is not relevant to every problem.
Thank you, Rob. Masumi's question is, can AI be considered a stakeholder?
Well, that's an interesting question. Just wrote a paper about that.
Oh, really?
Yeah, just got rejected. But we at least made it through one round. We'll send it somewhere else. And we started that. Rupert Younger at Oxford has a paper. If you Google Rupert Younger at Oxford and look at his CV, you'll see this paper of is AI a stakeholder? And my dean is writing. He's getting another PhD. I think he's writing his dissertation on that as well. What makes something the stakeholder? This is a question that I think we finally tried to answer. Many people have wanted to say, tell me who the stakeholders are for every case, for every business, in all situations, for all times. And I think that's a fool's errand. I think who has a stake depends on what problem you're trying to solve. If you're trying to solve a problem of what do we stand for here in this company, then I think it's pretty much customers, suppliers, employees, communities, people that want money. If you're trying to solve a problem, how does this new law in California affect my factory? You got to be a lot more nuanced than just those five big groups. Stakeholder theory is both an ethical and a strategic point of view at the same time. Can AI be a stakeholder? I would say people have wanted the environment. This is where this originally came up. Is the environment a stakeholder? Well, my take on that is to be a stakeholder, you got to be able to cause something. You got to be able to act. Environment can certainly act, but it can't take any sort of moral accountability. We don't say, damn that earthquake. Why did it do that? And to be a stakeholder, I think you need to be able to take some sense of moral accountability. And so I would say if you think about primary stakeholders as customers, suppliers, employees, communities, people with money, you think about secondary stakeholders as media, as people that can influence the primary ones. Then you have some candidates out here beyond that, like the environment, AIs, etc. Who maybe not the environment, but AIs. Possibly someday we could see them as having accountability. So I would think for those groups, I want to say, especially with the environment, who are you gonna hold accountable for it? If you wanted to be a kind of stakeholder, we would call it a tertiary stakeholder. But who's accountable? Because I want to find the people I can hold accountable that can change things. The environment can't. And so if the environment's a stakeholder, I want to hold customers. I want to hold employees. I want to hold competitors. I want to hold governments. I want to hold them accountable for what happens. What about AI? Who would I hold accountable if I can't hold the AI accountable? Well, I could hold, I think, users accountable and developers and maybe even programmers to do that. So I think if you want to make AI a stakeholder, or environment a stakeholder, you got to find somebody who's going to take responsibility for that. I think the best example of this is to think about children. Are children a stakeholder? Well, they can certainly act, but can they be held morally accountable? Well, at some age they can. But at other ages, what do? We say, well, no, it's parents' responsibility. And so before, they're a kind of stakeholder, but they're not the same kind of stakeholder that functioning adults are. So that's about the best I can do with AI. I think some people think stakeholders are all the important things. And for me, I always thought of it as a grid, down one side of which are the stakeholders, down the other dimension are a set of issues. And you want to grid in who's accountable for what issue or who's affected by what issue. And I've always thought environment ought to go on issue part, But sometimes people want to say, well, if you don't see the environment as a stakeholder, people won't take it seriously. I'm sensitive to that. I think it's just a different kind of stakeholder, and one that you still have to ask the question, well, but who's going to take responsibility here? Because stakeholders get stuff done, issues don't.
Mhm.
It's the groups and individuals who have agency who can act and be responsible. That's who I want to make the world better. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Yeah. All right, there's a couple more here. I'll
Yeah.
try to get to these. So Matthew Crago, you mentioned redefining humanity. Sorry, you mentioned redefining humanity is necessary in future business. What ethical principles do you think should guide this redefinition in an AI technology-driven world?
Well, I think in an AI technology-driven world, we need to make it a human AI technology-driven world. I don't know. Again, I'm a pluralist about that. I think there are lots of different ways to define who we are. But I think they have to recognize that in our history, we've been language using collaborators. Evolution, I think, selects for our ability to be a good collaborator, not red in tooth and claw. And what we do is we invent vocabularies to solve our problems. That's what the technologies are. They're vocabularies we've invented and made real by cooperating. So I think some principles around, we're social creatures. We collaborate together and we use our creative imagination. I think those are things that are both norms and I would say facts that are important as we think about this. But there are lots of ways to live. There are lots of conceptions of humanity. I think lots of I would say maybe even comprehensive ethical views. I'm not sure how important the comprehensive part of that is. Depends on the kind of problems we solve, the kind of lives we want to live, and questions like that. So I don't really have one answer for that. That there's a principle here that if we just obey this principle, we'll solve all our problems.
So we have a question from someone else you might know, Miguel Alzola from
Hey,
Florida
Miguel. Yeah,
University.
sure.
He's is a typed question, so I'll read it. Thank you for your great talk, Ed. My question is about academic business ethics. Is it fair to say that you have traced an ideological trajectory in business ethics that seems to move from a critical stance to a more market affirming one? Does it have an impact on the scholars the field attracts and the political positions it may advocate? Business involves the possibility of fraud, exploitation, and crime. Um, what role does business ethics play in responding to corporate fraud and malfeasance?
Well, I think that's right. Business also enables people to cooperate together to do stuff they couldn't do without it. I'm all for holding business accountable for the bad stuff. I don't have a problem with that. But just the bad stuff, I think, is a logic mistake. If I were to come in, Miguel, to your classroom and I were to say, we have a real ethics issue we have to deal with here, and I just want to, clue you in that this is a really important ethics issue. I'd be willing to bet that no one in the class has thought, oh, well, somebody must have created something really cool that makes our lives better. But if ethics is about the bad stuff, it's about the critical stuff, it's about the good stuff too. I mean, let's celebrate what companies have done and let's hold them accountable to do better. So I think the development of business ethics isn't from critical to sort of from left to right, from being critical of business to being yay business. To be critical in my world is to think about not only the bad parts but the good parts as well, and how the good parts can be better. And so I think business ethics has spent far too much invested in the business success story, because for the most part, people who teach business ethics don't have much idea about how real businesses actually work, or certainly they didn't. And so that's what I'm after is trying to find a more workable, critical view. Dan Gilbert and I wrote a paper in 1992, actually, in Business and Society, that was called something like critical management studies or critical business ethics or something like that. I don't remember the title. And we argued that we needed a more critical approach. But if the critical approach just was a tearing down, that's not very critical. And so I want a more nuanced idea about what big business is. We need to hold businesses accountable for fraud, et cetera, et cetera. And we need to hold them accountable for the good that they do as well. I think that's what a real sort of critical approach would be. Though I'm not trying to deny that the horror story stuff is bad. It's just that's not all it is. Business is how we create value for each other that no one of us can do alone. And I think we tend to forget that. But you and I can
Megan
argue about
Latch.
that for Miguel, you and I can argue about that for the next, well, 10 years or so if I make it that for that long.
Megan Latch has a kind of perennial question about stakeholder theory. She says, how can future business leaders balance profitability with creating value for all stakeholders?
So let me tell you a story, Megan, about how I was at a dinner. It's a pretty unpleasant dinner, actually, and there was a former congressman there. And he said to me, he said, Ed, suppose I was trying to explain to him what stakeholder theory was, et cetera, and some stuff we're doing here. He said, suppose I only care about the money. I don't care about anything but returns on the money I've invested. I just want the money. And I said, okay, let's assume you are the most self-interested, narcissistic, greedy bastard on the face of the earth. You only care about the money. That's all you care about. I just looked him in the face and said, how are you going to make it? You better have some customers that want your product, that they're willing to pay you for. It'd be nice if you had suppliers who are not just selling you stuff, but trying to make you better. You need employees who are not just there for the paycheck. You need communities who at least don't try to kick you out. And if you do those things and you get lucky, you might make money. So this dichotomy of profits versus purpose or profits versus stakeholders is just a false dichotomy. Stakeholders are interconnected. They're how you deal, how much money you make you can write it as a function of how much value you create for the others. And so profit itself is a kind of lagged variable. You only know you haven't made profits after you've already screwed up the relationships. So my take on this is just to be a good manager. You want to know when you're screwing up the relationships, not when it's too late that you've kind of you kind of ruined the profit equation. So I don't see. I think the old story tells us that those things are opposed, and I don't think they are at all. Profits are an outcome of how you manage stakeholder relationships.
Thanks, Ed. I'll take the liberty and ask the last question,
Sure.
and we'll let you rest. So you laid out this very positive picture of what, I don't know, what was year
Yeah.
2075 might look like. I guess one question is, how likely do you think that that picture is the picture that materializes? So
Pretty much zero.
because I like the idea that, like, ethics wins, stakeholder theory wins,
Yeah.
the narratives of greedy little bastards is ended. We emerge to kind of stakeholder capitalism framework. The environment is sort of sustainable, and we have clean and abundant energy. Um, but then your message is there's still a whole lot of other types of really big
Yeah.
ethical questions to think of. I'm just worried. I'm maybe not as optimistic. I don't know. And I fear that, like, the collective problems of, like, climate change are so huge that when you look at political divide, when you look at the inability for people to work across the aisle, when you look at, like, the amount of international, let alone corporate cooperation that we would need to achieve to solve that problem. Um, uh, Not that people are inherently evil or that businesses are intending to destroy the planet, but that collectively the kind of action that would be needed is monumental and probably on a scale like humanity has never really dealt with before. I'm not sure these problems are going to go away. So I'm
Well,
wondering,
I'm not either.
yeah.
I
So I
mean,
guess I'm wondering, like, yes, we have these new problems, and I think the prioritizing of humanity and the questions about AI and technology, and also the intricate kind of new emerging questions are really also very important. But I'm wondering about these sort of big ones that your optimistic view of
well,
2075 look like. Like how likely do you think that stakeholder theory will become the norm, and these other things will fall in
well,
place?
I do actually think that stakeholder theory is becoming the norm. I mean, I actually think that's true. Of course, there are all kinds of resentments and all that sort of stuff that exist, and that they may win. I don't think they will, but I don't know because I really think it's a better way to do business.
Mhm.
Uh, will the technologies and stuff work? I don't know. I think if they don't, we're you know I won't use the word I would normally use around my kids. But we are not
Yeah.
in good shape
Yeah.
if that happens, and business ethicists have plenty to deal with. I do think also, though, Greg, if we can focus on our humanity, what that does is it builds our creative imagination, and we're going to be able to maybe make some of these things real. I think we're more likely to do that than we are by the kind of woe is us kind of thinking. We have a principle we try to teach our students that we call critique through creation. You want to critique something, figure out a better way to do it. That's what entrepreneurs do, and I have more faith in that than I do in government solutions now, obviously. So I don't know. I think it'll be a process to see how well we do. You know, it may just be hot as hell, and we all move to Minnesota, where I lived for 3 winters, and it wasn't hot as hell. So I'm not sure about that. I'm not. What I would say, I forget who said this first, is I don't have time to be a pessimist.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to figure out a way that we could think about this stuff that might be more productive.
Yeah. Well, thank you. First, I just want to say that was a really inspiring and thought-provoking
Well,
talk.
thanks.
I really
Great
appreciate it for
questions.
your, yeah, yeah. And sorry if I didn't get to anyone's. I see that there's some more questions in there, but I don't want to keep our speaker longer than we
Well,
have.
Greg, I would just say if anybody has other questions, I'm available on email and stuff. I'm pretty easy to find.
It's very
And,
generous.
and I apologize for the coughing fits, but
Yeah.
whatever this virus is has me.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure it's not COVID, but that's a different thing.
Well, thank you, and you could go rest now. So
Yeah.
have a wonderful evening.
Okay.
Thank
Take
you,
care,
everyone,
everybody.
for
Thanks.
attending, and hopefully you can make our next one. So thank you.
Great. Thanks. Take care.